I have to say, we are in for a roller coaster ride, quite a difficult period in U.S. China relations for some period of time. I don't believe our current policies toward China serve our national interests. It is about hamstringing China's progress, maybe even pushing it back, which I think is doomed to fail. That will never happen. When I first arrived in China, and I was there again in 1973, China then was a study in contrasts. It was the last stages of the Cultural Revolution in China. China was isolated internationally. It was very poor. People wore very drab clothing. I went to the bookstore. There was virtually nothing to read there other than ideological material. I met Deng Xiaoping for the first time in New York, 1974. He came there to speech to the United Nations. Chinese government gave him $10 in foreign currency to spend. And he wanted to buy a present, his grandchild. And so I bought him a present and gave it to him. I subsequently saw China become a very different country. Much a lively intellectual environment, women who had been without makeup and very pretty, but not attractive in a general sense, began to wear colorful clothing. Now if you are in Beijing, you are in a city that is the match for any modern city anywhere in the world. The opening to China was a purely strategic matter on both sides. Mao Zedong, the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, realized that China was in danger of being invaded by the Soviet Union. There were skirmishes in both the northeast of China and in Xinjiang on the border. The United States saw this and realized that if China were removed from the global chessboard, we would be put in a much weaker position. And President Richard Nixon, who was a very strange man, but someone with real ability as a strategist, immediately reacted. And he reached out to China. Henry Kissinger, who gets all the credit for this, was actually opposed to the initial opening to China. He thought Nixon was crazy. But when he went to China, he discovered that the Chinese leadership was very sophisticated and that they thought a way that was similar to our own thought about how the world situation was developing. So, in effect, this was an arranged marriage. There was no love involved. Later, we began to appreciate each other. And we had a period when we were really quite happy together. But I think the American arguments for the opening to China, which were initially purely strategic, began to change. And the presidents of the United States, successive ones, Bill Clinton most notably, sold the relationship to China, to the American people, as a transformative process. And he imagined, I think, that inside every Chinese, there is an American trying to come out. But this is nonsense. Chinese want to be Chinese. They don't want to be Americans. And one of the great achievements of the Nixon opening to China was the Shanghai Communique, in which we recognized, both sides, that we have different socioeconomic systems, we have different ideologies, but we have some interests in common. And so we should look for a common ground, even and reserve the differences we can't solve now for later resolution. But that relationship was really never about either country changing the political system or of the other. That was a fraudulent claim. I will say that three things happened in 1989 that were important. There was the Liu Se, the uprising in Tiananmen Square that was put down, and this resulted in the end of the warmth in U.S. China relations. At the end of the year, in November 1989, the Soviet Empire collapsed. The Berlin Wall came down, and we suddenly didn't have a common enemy anymore. And sometime during that same year, Taiwan, which had been a dictatorship, became a democracy. Therefore, we had had no ideological affinity to Taiwan. Many people in the United States were anti-communist, but they weren't particularly affectionate toward the regime in Taiwan. But this changed also. So these three changes, the lack of the lack of warmth in the relationship, the end of a common enemy, and the emergence of Taiwan as an ideological challenger to good relations between Washington and Beijing, began a process that continued. And I think in the Obama administration, which was favorably inclined toward China, essentially, there were indications with the business community in the United States that they felt they were being mistreated in China and that competition was unfair. The Trump administration brought all of this together because they had a series of, in my view, incorrect theories about international trade policy and economics. And they looked at China and they saw a tremendous trade deficit with China, and they began to complain. Basically, what counts is your global trade balance, not your trade balance with any particular country. The same thing that has happened to employment in the United States is happening in China. And just as industrial employment collapsed in the United States or contracted because of automation, because of productivity increases, because of structural changes in the industry, that is happening in China. This is a process that has nothing to do with U.S. China relations, and Mr. Trump took advantage of this. He claimed he would fix this. I think what he is about to do is likely to make it worse. Well, I think we've both made mistakes. I think the Chinese side did not pay enough attention to the prime constituency in the United States supporting good U.S.-China relations, which is the business community. And the business community felt that it was being treated unfairly in China. But there are a lot of factors on the U.S. side which contributed to this deterioration in relations. I don't believe our current policies toward China serve our national interests. I think the emphasis on competition is not so much about competition as it is about hamstringing China's progress or retarding China's advance, maybe even pushing it back, which I think is doomed to fail. That will never happen. China is returning to wealth and power. Throughout history, for most of history, it was the largest, probably the best governed, scientifically and technologically the most advanced society on the planet. We should try to take advantage of China's prosperity to enhance our own. During the immediate post-Cold War period, the United States felt omnipotent, omniscient, and felt that it could act unilaterally. So we ceased to listen to people. We began to lecture them. And the result was essentially a diplomacy-free foreign policy, including a lack of dialogue, a substantial dialogue with China. So I think one of the things that we need to do on our side of the Pacific is rediscover diplomacy. Current Chinese diplomacy seems to do fairly well. Very strong diplomatic service, very competent foreign minister in Wang Yi. So I think it is we on the United States side who need to rediscover humility, modesty, listening, and arguments directed at persuading the other side rather than resorting immediately to coercive measures like sanctions or the use of force, which we're far too prone to do. The Trump administration will not take office until January 20th. So we don't know exactly what their policies will be. But the initial appointments to the cabinet suggest a very hard line. Mike Waltz of Florida is to be the national security advisor. He is notoriously anti-China in his statements. His deputy, Bridge Colby, who is more nuanced by far in his view of China, nevertheless sees China as a military threat. Marco Rubio, the new Secretary of State, to be nominated when the administration comes into office, is also a very hard line on China. And so we see a group of people coming into office who have deep prejudices and very strong political views which are antithetical to China. I hope they will learn in office that what they thought they knew, it was not true. But I'm not sure that will happen. So I think in basic terms, I have to say we are in for a roller coaster ride, quite a difficult period in U.S. China relations for some period of time. And I analogize the U.S. China split, the Sino-American split, to the Sino-Soviet split, which occurred for equally irrational reasons around 1960, and which it took 25 years to begin to repair. And it took actually 40 years to end it completely. And I'm afraid we are in for a period of similar duration in which we will struggle to rediscover all of the reasons that we should be cooperating rather than contending with each other. Three of my great-grandfathers worked in China. One, John Ripley Freeman, was the original designer of the Sanxia, the Three Gorges Dam. He worked for Sun Zhongshan for about half a year and designed that dam. Another, Robert Ezra Park, was instrumental in starting the sociology department, social sciences department at Beida, Beijing University. And a third one, whose ring this is, you see the jade ring, was Charles Wellman, after whom I'm named. Chas Wellman worked for Zhang Zhedong, trying to modernize the Chinese steel industry. So these were people who wanted China to advance, but they did not think that they should change China's values. They thought that was a matter for Chinese to address. Of course, we had missionaries who were trying to change Chinese values, and there's always been an impulse in the United States to try to persuade other countries to become more like us. So China, in many ways, has become more like us, but it retains its Chinese character, and some people don't understand that.